Good morning, everyone. I am Mattia Gianotti. I am the second teaching assistant for the course of Hypermedia Applications held by Professor Garzotto. And today we start a group of lectures dealing with front-end technology that are useful for you in the sense that we present you the technologies that you are allowed to use for your project for this course. In particular, today, we are going to deal with a very high-level recap on the web architecture that we use for websites, and then we will describe HTML and CSS, going for the structure of the code that you will use, their basic elements, and then improvements and the advanced features that the newer version of HTML and CSS offer you. So remember that when we talk about websites or web services, we have a clear distinction in mind between what is called backend and frontend. Well, the backend is everything that the user is not able to touch, whereas the front end is what the user is able to interact with. And these two, in general, may have powering them. And in particular, we are going to deal with the very basic three-tier architecture that is the most common used for web applications. And in this architecture, you have an initial data layer where you have all the relevant information for your website, an application layer that is the place where you have elaboration and aggregation of those information so that you show to the user only some kind of features and some kind of elaboration over the data you have stored. And then you have a presentation layer that is everything that the user can really see. That for web applications, it goes for everything that is seen inside the browser. However, this is not the only possible solution. It has been very famous for some years, the so-called two-tier architecture, in which the application layer was a little bit spread around between the presentation layer and the data layer. And this was an initial attempt to go for web applications instead of websites. However, we have seen that this approach that is often called smart client dummy server or smart server dummy client, depending on the remaining layer that has the largest part of the intelligence stored in it, has shown a lot of limits, and so nowadays is very rarely used. On the other hand, what is really done now is to go for multi-tier architecture. In this case, you have additional layers between, for example, the application logic and the database, or between the presentation layer and the application server. And these layers are generally used for security reasons, or in the very last years, they have been used for machine learning approaches. So you have, for example, a machine learning layer that is going to elaborate the data in your database, and then your application layer is just able to reason and describe things as the machine learning layer present them. So not really touching the real data. However, all of this discussion is something that is not really interesting for the scope of this lecture, and that's why I'm just stopping it right now, even if it's a very interesting topic, because for today, we are just focusing on front end. And this means that we are just focusing on how the user is going to perceive the data you have stored, and what can the user do with the presentations that you realize for them. And to do this, remember that we have very simple technology. So we are going to use HTML and CSS that we are going to see today. In the next lecture, you are going to be introduced to JavaScript, jQuery, and AJAX. And in the final lecture, we will discuss about the Bootstrap and accessibility. So these are the technology we are really going to use inside this course, and the technology that you are allowed in the end to use for your project, for the project you have to deliver for the exam of this course. And in particular, we are going to use HTML5, CSS3 as the versions of the two libraries for a set of specific reasons that we are going to describe throughout this lecture. So just a minor recap on what these elements do. You know that HTML5 is a language that is used to define the structural logical properties and, to a certain extent, the content and how the content is placed inside the web page. On a CSS level, you are going to describe the layout and the aesthetic of your web page. With Bootstrap, you are going to increase the potentiality of CSS through a framework to get responsive websites. And this means that you are going to be able to bring your websites also to mobile applications and mobile devices and tablets in a very easy way. On the other hand, with JavaScript, you are going to bring interactivity to the web page so that the user can actually do something with the web page. And with AJAX, that is an evolution of JavaScript, you can perform communication with the backend part in an asynchronous way. But to better understand why this is so important, I will leave this topic to the next lecture dedicated on JavaScript and AJAX. So just before we begin, what do you need to have? And the requirements for the front-end part, for the tools that you need to use in the front-end part, are very simple. You just need the browser, and we highly suggest you to use Google Chrome or Firefox, because they have good development tools that you can easily use. Chrome is actually better, but if you really don't want to use Google, you can use Firefox. If you want instead for writing the code, you can use Brackets and Visual Studio. We just suggest you these two programs because they are free. Actually, you can have also a download viewer, which is which you should pay actually until at least until last year. It was something that you need to pay, or you can use any text editor, so Sublime Text, Notepad++, Notepad, whatever except for Word can be used to write code for the web technologies. What you should not use are Opera, Safari, and Internet Explorer or Edge. They have very poor development tools and they have non-standard rendering. So the effect that you will see on the rendering of the web page made by Safari, Opera, and especially Internet Explorer are not the ones that we will see when we are going to evaluate your project. We are going to evaluate your project on Google Chrome. So if you have everything working on Google Chrome, you're fine. Of course, there are also other online tools you can use to write the code for the front-end part. However, there is a little bit of a problem then when you have to bring the code you have made inside your actual server. And thus, we are not really suggesting you to do it, but if you really want, you can. What we highly suggest you also to do is to create a Git repository for your code, because in this way it's faster to share with your colleagues, and also we will ask you in the end to be able to access your code for the evaluation of the exam. So let's start from the very beginning of the technologies for front-end part. And at the very beginning of the web, there is only one thing that was important, and this was to have a document that was readable by a program that is called a browser, and that is able to bring you from one hypertext to another. And the idea was to invent HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And for those of you who do not know what is a markup language is a language that is machine readable, and it is defined by a limited set of tags that the machine is able to understand, and through being able to understand them, it's able to give a meaning to what's inside these tags. And in this way, you can define a document that can be shared by all machines around the world. Of course, markup languages are not just limited to web technologies. We see that XML and LaTeX, that many of you probably have already faced for other courses, are all markup languages. Markup languages are actually not programming languages. So if anyone is going to ask you if you can program on HTML or CSS, you just know that he's not able. He do not know what he's talking about. But that often happens, especially in when you're going to have a job interview. So markup languages are not programming language, are called descriptive task languages because they are meant to describe and to state what are the elements of something inside a document. In the last line of these slides, I am presenting you the standard version of a tag inside languages such as HTML and XML. So you see that you have an angular bracket, the name of the tag, the an attribute name equals to a string, it is a value. Inside you have a content, and then you have a closing element that has this angular brackets slash and back again the name of the tag that you opened. This is one standard way of creating tags, and as I said, it's useful in HTML and XML. However, in other languages such as CSS and JSON, there is another convention, which is tag name, colon, value, semicolon. And these two approaches are equally good. They are equally applied throughout the world, and they present both pros and cons. So you have both of them at the same time, because actually they are quite useful for different aspects, and each of them has its own pros and cons. However, if you are going to create your new markup language for any reason in your future work, just remember to start from one of these two two definitions, because they have proven to be very effective and quite powerful. So what is the concept of an attribute? First of all, when you have an HTML page, just remember that you cannot mess up too much with the structure. You have a three-element structure that you need to always take in consideration. The first tag is this declaration type of the document, this doc type HTML, is going to use to understand how to interpret the rest of the document. So it must be always in the first line. And what is the idea? The idea is that if the machine is reading this document, he already knows how to process your web page, and so it's faster, and on many other levels, it can resource many more information and computational power on rendering properly the web page. However, it is not mandatory, because for modern web browsers, at least, when you have a document that the browser do not know, because it do not read this doc type tag, he tries to interpret it as an HTML file. However, this, given the incredible evolution of web applications, software service approach, cloud approaches, etc., maybe this can change in the future. So it's a good idea to be already prepared and be compliant with this good practice to always indicate the document type. Then you have a tag, which is this HTML tag, which encapsulates the real content of the web page, and is the starting point for each analysis that the browser is going to do on any of the objects that you want to have inside your web page. Then you have the first block that's called head, and inside this head tag, you are going to define the meta properties of your web page. Such, for example, you can import the resources such as CSS, JavaScript, etc. And then you can define, for example, the tab name and the icon that your browser is going to show. Whereas in the body part, you will see the real content of the page. So whatever is inside the body part of the HTML file is rendered inside the browser as part of the web page. Is everything clear for now? Someone is still following me? Okay. So, what is the structure of this web page? The web page is structured in a way that you can be manageable by a machine. So remember that a machine is not very smart, and is not able to understand each block per se, but it needs a structure. And this structure is composed inside what we call the DOM, domain structure model. And the idea is that we create a document object that contains every part of your web page, and this object is composed as a tree, as a mathematical tree of all the elements inside your web page. And this is going to be very useful, because thanks to this DOM, you will be able to get information on specific elements of the page, and then you can decide what to do with them. Also, it's very useful because it lets you to properly render the web page, placing everything inside the correct order you really want to do. So why to use a tree? The tree is very efficient. It's a very efficient way of having navigation, and it's very easy to validate. And it also possesses some hierarchical properties that for the moment are not very interesting, but when you add CSS, you will understand that can make quite a difference. For the few of you, I'm thinking especially to designers that are not familiar with tree structures, a tree is a mathematical structure that is defined by some elements that are called nodes, and one relation that is called parent-children relation, in which you assign to any object one parent node and only one parent node, and a number from 0 to infinite number of children. In this way, you can move from one special node that is called the root node, that is the only one that do not have a father, until you reach the last element of the trees. And you do not need to pass through all the elements of the tree in general, but you can just walk through some path, and in this way it's much easier to analyze and faster to reach the objective, the desired elements. I placed here a very easy example of what do I mean by parent-child description. However, this poses one problem, and this is especially true for HTML. And the problem is inside the closing tag. Closing tag may be quite difficult if you are not writing the code in a very structured way. Because to define this parent-children relationship, the browser is going to check for every element that are open and closed before you close the tag that has been opened. So you said that if you are in the parent node, the children of the parent node are all the elements that have been opened and closed before the parent node has been closed. However, if you mess up this order, it may be that you have an inconsistent tree. So maybe the parent div is closed before one of the children, or something in the middle happens, and this makes your code, your tree non-readable by the machine because it's not well formatted, and in the end your browser is going to not being able to understand how to render your web page properly. So what does the browser do in the end? The first aspect is to load the HTML. So your browser, when you start typing the URL of your website, the browser is going to ask for that URL, and in that URL he somehow receive the code, the HTML code of your web page. From this code, he starts analyzing and parsing it. So he checks if it's a well-formatted HTML file, and then start analyzing the head part of the file. Inside the head part of the file, he searched for the CSS and JavaScript and asked back for that components to be downloaded similarly to what happened for the HTML file. Letting apart the JavaScript for now, he loads the CSS file and start parsing it. Now, in parallel, he creates the DOM tree from the body part of your HTML file. And when the DOM is ready and the CSS is ready, the browser is going to join the two elements and paste them together so that he has a DOM with all the CSS properties properly inserted inside the rendering final content, which is then passed to the display function, which is the one that actually transform that information inside the pixels that are being shown inside the browser. Only at the end of this process, JavaScript is going to be invoked. So please remember that, for example, you cannot fix through JavaScript a broken HTML, because the moment you reach here to execute the JavaScript file, you will never reach here because it stopped here. Your browser is going to stop here. So how can you work on HTML? In HTML, you have really a lot of different attributes and tags. I will not describe all the tags because there are really too many for being able to manage them inside one single lecture, and they are not even quite interesting. I mean, they are just describing you some very basic properties of the HTML page, and you can easily find them inside the online references that I will add in the end of the on the slides. But there is a little bit of more interest in going to analyze the attributes that are allowed inside HTML. But before starting, just a couple of notes. HTML is a case-insensitive language. It means that you can write in lowercase or uppercase or mixed case, whatever it is, and for the browser, it's all right. You do not need to go for a specific way of writing things. However, it is a convention to write it in lowercase, because for codifications of the char set, that is more standard, let's say. And for the same reasons, you can also use it's a standard to use double quotes for all the attributes containing strings. It's not mandatory. You can also use a simple quote or apex. However, since these elements may suffer of character set misalignment, so if you write your web page and save it, encoding them through different char sets, this for a single apex especially may be a problem. You are highly suggested as a standard to use quoting, double quotes. Quoting is the, how can I explain it? When you need to encapsulate a value to describe the value of an attribute, yes, exactly. You need to place it inside inside quotes, so it is identified as the value associated to the attribute. To do it, you open quote, write the value, close the quote. These quotes may be double, single, or apex, as you want. The standard is to use double quotes. But the real aspect that is interesting is that is the one related to attributes. And the most important thing is that an attribute is a modifier that you want to add, specify one specific property of one specific tag. So we said before that your browser is going to give a meaning to the content of the tag according to which tag you have used. So for example, you can use h1 tag to identify a title and a p tag to identify a paragraph, even if the text inside the two is exactly the same. However, imagine, for example, that you want to add an image to your web page. The image tag is something that you describe, and the browser knows that he has to prepare a rectangular shape with that size in pixel for the width and the height, and that inside of it he has to load the multimedia content. However, you do not want either to have one tag for each, one different tag for each possible image you want to store inside your web page, because that's unfeasible and you cannot imagine your browser to be able to understand it. And on the other hand, you cannot force your user, your design to have one single image for the whole web page. So what is going to happen is that you're going to use an attribute that is src, the source file, and through this source attribute, you are going to express the image that you want to load inside the rectangle. So the HTML, the browser is going to read your tag. He is then going to create a rectangular shape with empty white pixels, and then go for this URL that you have used to describe your image. And at this point, you can he can print each of the pixels of the image for the proper image you want to design. And this is not just for images. You can add tags, and so you can add attributes to tag whenever you want and for any reason you want. There are some tags, so some attributes that are available for almost all tags. Some attributes are available only for just a few set of tags, and some attributes may be non-standard. I mean, the browser is just not knowing how to interpret them, but maybe you know how to interpret them. Because at a certain point, you will know that through JavaScript, it is possible to being able to take one specific element of your web page and read, for example, through these attributes, you can decide to do one thing or another. And to do this, maybe you want to create new attributes that you want to add inside your tags. And these are just being ignored by the browser because he does not know how to manage them, but maybe you know how to manage them. So that's perfectly fine. However, there are two two attributes that are quite important. The first is the class attribute that is going to give to one or more actually of your elements of your tags inside your web page some specific properties, especially CSS properties. Remember that classes are not limited by the tag type. It's very common to see that you have some special classes that depend on the tag. So you have the big box, yellow box, and the big box maybe refers to div blocks, and you only use it for div blocks. However, remember that, for example, the yellow box may be applied to this div box, but then later on a button. It is a completely different tag, but may share the same class. An ID instead is an attribute that identifies one and only one specific element throughout all the web page you are rendering. And remember that when you start making IDs, if you for any reason make a mistake and have more than once the ID tag, the same ID tag, this may be a really huge problem. For example, if you need to access them through JavaScript. Is it all clear till now? Any more question, doubt, whatever? Okay. So let me make you an example of how all these things bring up together and create something very strange. And this is the example of the input tag. The input tag is quite a special thing because it's a tag that is active only inside another tag. And this tag is the form tag. The form tag has an attribute, which is this action attribute, that, for the sake of this example, is a very simple PHP file, which is a backend script that contains some functions so that you pass them some information and he's doing something with them. Inside this form the form tag, you have a list of input tag. An input tag is anything the user can interact with. However, you need to specify what kind of information you expect your user to insert. And for this reason, you use this type attribute. And this type attribute, in this case, is a submit button
but here you see that it may have a lot of different alternatives depending on exactly what you want to achieve. And each of these attribute, this type actually enables other attribute to be added to the input tag. When you have this submit button, it has also a special behavior, because the moment you click the submit button, what's going to happen? It's going to happen that automatically the interpreter inside your browser is going to search for the upper form tag, the parent form tag actually. Then he starts searching for all the input tags. Inside the input tags, you may have another attribute that is associated to a name, and inside this name, and he used this name and the value that has been inserted by the user in the input tag to create a key value pair, name of the tag, value. This pair of elements is going to be used by the system to automatically generate a JSON file, which is another declarative language, in which you have this definition of pairs of values, of key values, pair values, and when he reads all the elements inside the form, he's going to connect to the web page that you have associated here in the action page, and send all the this formatted document with all the information the user inputted and the names of the input tag that have been used to input them to this file. And this is a very, very common and quick way of doing online forms, because in the backend part, you received a machine-readable document inserting all the information the user inputted you inside the web page in a very, very easy and well-structured way. Of course, you need to set in which kind of method you want to send information. If you make them with post, you have this effect, but there are a lot of other alternatives. So for all the very specific implementation of this, you can resort to the online documentation. I was just making you slightly simplified examples to let you understand what is the power of attributes inside tags. So now that we have said all of these things, why should we bother about the version? As far as I've described you things for now, there is no real values in getting an increase in the version from HTML4 to an HTML5. It's just for pure sake of update. However, in these slides, I want to show you what are the actual important differences that have been introduced with HTML5 that is going to make your life much easier and much more useful inside your web pages. So for example, just see in the first line the difference between the description, how do you need to declare the document. In HTML5, you have this very compact and easy to write and easy to remember also declaration. However, in HTML4, you have this massive written tag that is very easy to and prone to errors. So why bother also much? It's way much easier to do it like this. And similarly, you have the char set, which means how the browser is going to translate the bits inside the web page that you receive inside the characters that then is going to interpret to render the web page. Another very cool aspect is that in HTML5 it has been introduced the concept of canvas and the possibility of having sorry, I will answer you in a moment. Is going to be inserted the possibility to have natively canvases and vector graphics, which for the moment is not that interesting, but when we reach the part of CSS, you will understand that it's going to be a very interesting and very powerful tool. In HTML4, what is specified is the namespace for the tags. I don't understand really your question. What do you mean in HTML4? Inside the tag that I've shown you here? No, this is not the specification of the tags. Not really the specification of the tags. It's a declaration of how the web page is going to interpret the tags. You may have all the tags you want. Even in HTML5, you may have non-standard tags. There's not a problem. The browser is just going to ignore them. However, in this declaration type is going to be inserted the basic graphical properties that need to be applied to render the content of the tags. So, for example, that H1 is you write the text and you write the text in a higher font. Whereas for the image, you need to create a rectangle, and inside this rectangle, you need to check for the properties of the image in the that is written inside that way. Is it clearer or is still quite foggy? Okay. Another interesting aspect in HTML5 is that we have added native support for some JavaScript functions that have been much more used in the last years. For example, geolocalization and local storage instead of the cookies that we had seen before and that were that present security and privacy problems under many levels. So this has been quite an interesting evolution, and through HTML5 it has become possible to natively draw geometrical shapes inside the canvases, and these allow an evolution of other languages such as WebGL, which some of you may have noticed, may have known, because there is a full course of under this topic inside our master program. That is the way in which you can create 3D worlds and 3D environment inside a web page. Another important aspect I want to let you know is that from HTML5, JavaScript is able to be rendered in a parallel thread, which means that when your web page is elaborating a very complex script, it's no more stuck. What happened before is that if the script was too long to execute, your web page froze. Now this is not going to happen anymore. However, all this important advancement has a little bit of a drawback, and it is that HTML5 is supported only by modern browsers. So if you're in a in some very special situations in which you have a condition of non-updated software, all these things is not going to work. And this is not just for saying, okay, who cares? But consider that, for example, for a long time in the public health system, there was a web application that was meant to be used by the doctors to share the information with the with the ministry
about how many drugs they have been prescribing to the citizens, and this application worked only in Explorer 5. Even if we were already to Explorer version 7 or 8 or Google Chrome, they were already very famous and widely used. And this made up a lot of problems because the hospitals were forced to use this application, and that means that they were forced to use a very old, buggy, and unsecure version of Internet Explorer. So this problem of the update of the browser may be really something that can bother you. One last thing is that thanks to HTML5, we get rid of a lot of very unuseful and nasty plugins that were required to manage video and audio. Now we have these these video controls and audio controls tag that are extremely useful and extremely easy to achieve, so that now it's very easy to have video and audio played inside your web page. I will not dig into the specification. I leave here some attributes, value, and descriptions, and the official references, so that in case you need them for your project, you can search them. Now that we have described how you can write an HTML page, there is one question that is still pending. If I create a website, from where my website is going to be rendered? And the answer is quite easy. It is that the browser is going to search for an index.something web page as a standard. You may change this behavior by changing a specific file, which is this htaccess, that however is not often used. So in the most general cases, you just have an index.html page, and the browser is going to search for it. But what happens if you do not have this kind of document? And the result is that most of the browsers, unless some security measurement have been taken, is going to show you the directory of the files that are available on your server, which is actually something you do not want to happen. So please bear in mind to have this kind of convention, or if you do not want to go for this convention, change this file according to what you want to have. So, okay, one of your colleagues is asking what is the difference between a cookie and the local storage. The difference is pretty trivial, actually. The cookie is a structured information that is saved in your machine for whenever, and that can be accessed by all the website, whereas the local storage is divided into two major features. One is session storage, and one is the proper local storage. And local storage is something that is staying inside the memory of your browser for a long time until you clear it, while session storage is a memory space that is valid only until you close the tab, basically, of the browser. But the most important aspect is that they are still a structured memory, so you can access them as if you were writing inside a JSON file or any kind of file, a structured file, but they are managed more like a sandbox. So only the website that has written that part of the storage is able to access that part of the memory. So you cannot share the information on the local storage between two websites. Is it more clear or is it still unclear? Exactly. Actually, the real cookies were not designed to be accessible by everyone. It's just that they were implemented in this way, and in the end, they became a security threat because other malicious websites could also read the cookies by knowing some very easy to detect information inside the cookies themselves. So they were not safe. But yes, that's exactly the idea. Okay. Is any other question about HTML or the topics that we have seen so far? Otherwise, we are going to change and talk about CSS. I suppose that since no one is making questions, I can go on. So now, as we said, we want to provide a decent aesthetic to your web page, and that's because HTML has been designed to be rendered somehow, but it was designed for a very scientific reason. So it was really easy and not really aesthetically pleasant. The only important thing is it was to provide the desired content. So nowadays we need to add some aesthetic into our web page, and to do it we have basically three different options. The first option is this first link rel style sheet whatever tag. This is a tag that must be inserted inside your head part of the web page, and this means that you have this reference here, which is the name of the file you want to read. Browser read it as a text, so translate binaries inside letters, and then interpret it as a style sheet. So interpret it as CSS, as a CSS document. And this is the best way of doing CSS linking and providing style to your web page. There are other two possible alternatives. One is to use the style tag inside the header part of your web page, in which you describe directly the style you want to apply to the web page. This was a very common solution a lot of years ago, actually. But when the website became very large and they need to have a coordinate set of graphical properties, it became immediately obvious that you were not this was not a sufficient solution, because you may have dozens of elements copied in all the web pages, and this is crazy. So you should not do it unless very rare and specific cases that, for example, now I cannot even think of. What you absolutely do not should not do is to use inline style. Inline style means that you add the style attribute to the HTML tag, and here describe the style you want to associate. This is a possible solution because this is actually what's going to happen in the end inside your browser, but you should never do it because it makes your code absolutely unreadable and unmanageable by anyone else. So this is you must not do it, otherwise otherwise you will get a 0 mark inside the front-end technology part of your evaluation, which contextually means that you are not going to pass the exam. The only reason you are allowed to do this is during debugging. So when you have some very strange CSS behaviors that you do not understand what's going to happen, what's going on, you may want to resort to, for just debugging purposes, to use in-style HTML, in-style CSS to clear out some of the elements that you do not, that you think they are not the ones that creating new problems, and then start analyzing them. But if we find this kind of approach in the final version of your project, you will not pass the exam. Similarly, in JavaScript, you can import an external JavaScript file with this script source whatever tag, or you can directly write the script files inside the web pages. Again, the difference is just that if you go for this option, the first option, you will just have a shareable script that you can use in any other page, whereas here you have some very specific scripts that are only relevant to this page, or that are absolutely required to be placed inside the web page because they need to be executed at that specific point of the evaluation of the web page. However, this first solution is much more preferable. I see that there are a couple of questions. What about overriding some important styles? How do you do it without inline? Let me wait for a moment. It's a topic that I will deal in a couple of slides more. So just trust me, it is possible. Leave me a couple of minutes to get it here. The style in the theme CSS file is for fonts only. What happens with other elements as button or images? No, inside the theme.css file, you may have styles for everything, not just fonts. So you may have the style of the body, the style of the title, H1, the style of the button, whatever it is. There's no inside this theme.css you have everything. Actually, the font family that you are going to use, that you're going to import, it's something that should be placed as a sibling of this in another kind of tag that you will see. Otherwise, you're just going to use the default fonts inside your web page, but they are not part of the CSS. In the CSS, you are going to be able to give properties on how to modify and how to use those fonts, but if you want to add more fonts, it is not part of the CSS file. So we have already described CSS, so I can go on for easy on this. So the idea is that you're going to save a lot of work of sharing different style between the web pages, and you can control multiple web pages with the same style sheet, so the same CSS, or maybe you can create multiple versions of the same web page, changing the style. Also, with the most advanced version of CSS, you can create animation, and I will show at the end of the lecture how to do it. It's not easy, but you can have animations without the need of coding any of them, which in some cases may be very interesting. I leave you here some of cool examples of CSS. So if you want to get inspiration from this, it's absolutely fine, and you will see some very cool stuff. So take a look at them when you start designing your application, the visual aspects at least of your applications. Just one important notice, when you want to access this CSS information, you just press, and if you are going to use Google Chrome, just press F12 and you will see this kind of structure. You have here the HTML structure, and by clicking on the different tags you want that you want to understand what's going on, you see here the list of all the possible aspects, CSS aspects that is going to be applied to that tag. As we said, CSS is a declarative language, so it's again not a programming language. It is made as a set of statements that describe one property, colon, the value of the property, and in case you have more than one property to use, a semicolon to separate them. Just remember, guys, please switch off the microphone. Okay. Just remember that in CSS, there is no error dealing. So if you write something that is badly written or for any reason that is not working properly, you will see no error at all in your web page, not even in the console of the browser. It's just going to be ignored. So maybe if you write a lot of CSS together and then try it out and it doesn't work, this may be can be complex to sort out and understand where the bug is. And the other thing you should remember, related to this especially, is that CSS is made in US spelling standard. So, for example, color and center are written in American English and not in UK English. So, as we said, you can apply the style to different elements. You can apply CSS over a tag. In this case, all the elements that share the same tag will be affected by the style you use. You can use a class, so you may apply different style to a subset of items, even of coming from different tags. And you can apply a style specific to an object, a specific identity. But as one of your colleagues was saying, this may be a problem because the description in the CSS may clash, and maybe you have a conflict in the properties you are going to use. So there is an order of how CSS is going to be applied. And first you apply the tag style. So you apply the style that belongs to a tag. Then you start applying the style that belongs to a class. And in case you have a clash here, whatever is clashing that is placed inside the class is going to override everything that has been placed that is clashing and is placed inside the tag. And you do the same thing then with ID style and then inline style. In this way, you always know who is going to have the dominant properties, and you can sort out these overriding properties. However, there is a trick that can be used, that is to use this clause exclamation mark important. Using this clause, you can state that a property should not be overridden according to this rule. So suppose that you have the background that is black inside the tag filter, the tag style, that is important. Even if in the ID part you say that the background color should be gray, the property is still going to be rendered as black background because the tag property has this important clause in it. However, if at a certain point I decide that in the ID class that gray background is going to be important as well, this rule comes back into action, because now they are both important, they are both clashing important, and the ordering is then again sorted out in this way. Do not overuse the important clause, because it's getting things very, very nasty in the end. So use it with care and only when it's strictly necessary. Just so that you know, you may see that in many sites, especially those that are a bit old websites, this .important tag has been used really a lot. And the reason why is that, as we said before, Internet Explorer has a non-standard way of rendering web pages. And to cope with this problem, there has been used a lot of important clause to force Internet Explorer to render the properties in the way that the other browser was doing. But since Internet Explorer is no more an issue, this is no more that much of important, and you should not overuse this clause if it's not meant or necessary. We said also that CSS make an extensive use of the hierarchical structure of HTML. And the reason is that you can decide to create properties with these the hierarchical modifiers that depend on the structure of the web page. So let's take, for example, the first example here. This is a descendant selector, the space. And this means that you are going to make a background color yellow under the paragraph only if this paragraph is at a certain point is descending from a div. And descending means that there is a path in the tree from my paragraph to a tag that is called div. Whereas with the children selector, the minor, you can have sort out things so that the paragraph must be directly connected as a son to a div file, a div tag. Addition siblings with a plus means that it comes immediately after and is at the same level. So it's the next tag and is at the same level in the tree of your of the div file, of the div tag. And with the sibling selector, the general sibling selector, you just say that any paragraph that is at the same level of the div paragraph, of the div tag, is going to be colored in yellow. You can play out a lot with these options, and you can have very cool stuff, and you can, in this way, sort out some special classes without the need of specifying a special class, which is very interesting. However, remember that for any reason, if you then decide to swap things inside your HTML file, this is going to be messed up. So you need to come back and understand them better again. So remember that in CSS and in HTML, everything is contained inside the box. And the box is nothing but a rectangular, because for the sake of it, for the sake of practicality, all the content inside the browser is rendered as rectangles. Even if, for example, you have a round image, it's still going to be considered as a rectangle, and then you filter out the points that are outside the circle. Around this rectangular, you have three different areas. One is the padding, one is the border, and one is the margin. So padding and margin are empty spaces, whereas the border is, in general, is used as filled area around the content. And playing with it, you can play with the distances between the different elements, and you can highlight things at a certain level. In these slides, I show you the different ways in which you can give these properties to a rectangle for each of the elements of the HTML tags. Remember that each of them has these properties. So these are things that are valid for any tag inside HTML. But there can be a difference in how you want to express the measurement of, especially for these kind of values. And there are actually four types of way of expressing dimension. The first is the simplest one, and is describing the number of pixels on the screen as an absolute measurement. And this is not very good unless for things such as, for example, saying that the minimum width of a button is 50 pixels. So you describe a minimum or maximum size. However, if you start going for this pixel, the amount of pixel measurements, remember that this is going to be a problem when you want to then make your page responsive to the dimension of the actual screen you are going to show things on, because he's still going to use an absolute measurement, and if it's not fitting inside the screen, it's just going outside the screen, which is a very bad situation. The EM measurement is something that is very useful for font size, so everything that has to be related to the text in general can be quite easily used in EM. RAM unit is an evolution of this EM that is not really much used, but basically you can assume it's exactly the same as EM. So the idea is that you have a measurement that is related to the font size again. In the percentage version instead is something that is saying that you take the maximum measurement given by the device, so the maximum width and maximum height of the screen of the device you are currently using, and from this you compute the measurement. Whereas there is this auto alternative, which is an auto adaptation made with respect to the width-height ratio of the content. This is a very cheap and not really useful solution, so you should avoid it as much as possible. It was something very common some years ago, where when the designers have not yet taken the lead on designing and giving a decent way of doing things inside web pages. It's something that we lazy engineers defined to be faster, but it's actually giving very poor results, so you should not do it unless very specific cases. Remember that you can also decide in which way you want to describe blocks. So there is a question. Is the use of percentage recommended? It depends. I will recommend to use percentage and EM or RAM measurements, depending if you want to work relatively to the font size, which is something that the user may want to decide in the setting of the browser, for example, because he has poor sight or not, or percentage that is something that is using the screen width and dimension of the screen. So depending on what element you are going to use and what kind of property you want to define, probably EM and percentage are both to be used. Pixel is something you should use only for minimum size, because you want to be sure that something is clickable, and clickable means that you have at least 50 times 50 pixels of space around it, whereas auto is something you should never use. Is it clear or still? Okay. So I was saying that you can have statements to decide in how you want to order things inside your web page. And you basically have 4 options. The block option is the one that is mostly used, and it means that each tag is going to be placed in a new line. Even if there is space, like in this example, to place it next to the previous tag, you are still going to place it down on the new line, and this is basically the default setting for everything. Inline, instead, it means that you add all the blocks together, and until there is space in it, you have sorry, this is inline. You have you are adding elements in it. This is not very it's not going to work perfectly with all the tags. For example, here you are using a paragraph and span tags, which are very useful for the inline. When you, for example, need to place a text and an image, it's recommended to use an inline block somehow. The last option is none, which is basically do not show them, the option for not showing the content. And this is quite useful if you want to make some elements in the web page that are present, but you do not want to show them already to the user. Okay, for the inline block, for the inline, you just add one element inside the style of the thing that has been placed before. So it works very well if you are going, for example, with bringing together different aspects from the same text. Like in the example here, you have a bold and an italic part. These 2 parts have been realized with span tags that have been placed in line within this text, and that have special properties. However, if you want to use something that is like an image, for example, you should resort here because you have much more properties and flexibility, and it's even and they have better qualities. For example, when you want to decide on which side you want to align things, that is very, very easy to do it with an inline block. However, we are not going to dig too much in it, because in the end we are going to use a Bootstrap framework that is going to be much more useful than going on with all this stuff for the blocking part, because it's actually not so easy to manage out in the end. So we are going to use the Bootstrap framework to sort out this major complexity around here. Instead, the none display is an option to say do not show. So I hide you some of the content that is physically it has been placed inside the web page, but I'm not showing it. And the effect is just that it's not the effect where you see an empty area. You just do not see anything. So it's something like width 0, height 0 element. This is used, for example, if you are in a form and you want to show some specific question according to a radio button, you have all the questions already prepared, and then according to which radio button has been selected, you remove you have in display none all the elements that are not related to the radio button that has been selected, and you have as a block the questions, the specific question that refers to the radio button the user has chosen, for example. Is it clearer now or still foggy? Okay. Another very important aspect, especially since you are going to work together with designers, or even if you are not going to work with designers, but you are going to use templates online that have been made by designers, is that you need to be aware that colors can be expressed in a lot of different ways. And in particular, you see that there are 6 ways of expressing colors in CSS. The first 4 are actually the ones that engineers in general use, which are color names, which are a predefined set of basic colors that are basically the extreme of this RGB circle. Hex color, that is the version of hexadecimal values with an hashtag in front of it that you often see when you search for color coding. You have RGB values, that is the translation of hex color into integer values from 0 to 255. And the possibility to have an alpha value, which is the opacity value, so the possibility to have a transparency of the color. But is often very much used, especially by designers, the HSLA possibly coding. And this coding is quite peculiar because it represents the color as a first value as an angle on this circle from 0 to 360 degrees. And in this way, it's easier to have values and describe the color with a single value. However, then you can describe the luminosity of the value as a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 is completely black and 100 is completely white, to move between the darker and lighter version of the same color. And then you have brilliance that decide how much the color is vivid. When you have 100 is completely vivid, so the brightest possible alternative. Whereas if you go for 0, you basically see everything in grayscale. And these are, of course, you have again the alpha opacity value if you want. And this is very useful because it lets you create palettes that share some of very cool properties that we in general try to forget of, because we are not very, as engineers, aware of the properties of colors, but that people from, especially from communication design, are very, very good at finding these properties and to use them in the best way possible. So just remember that you have all these possible alternatives. However, in the end, your browser is going to revert everything into an RGB value, because actually the screen of your computer works in RGB. So everything in the end is going to be reverted here. But you can express them in all the different ways. Especially talking about colors, remember that there are some guidelines that you need to follow, even if you are not a designer, for having something that is useful and can be actually used by users. So you see here a couple of really bad examples of how things should not be done. But here you have some of the very basic tricks that you can use to decide which kind of colors and how many colors you want to have inside your web page. If you want, then I add you here a cool website link in which you can go in the past as a more or less a time machine and go back analyzing the websites that are now accessible on the internet in the evolution of their interfaces through the years. Again, this is quite an interesting tool you can use to move forward and decide on your design features you want to add to your websites. So we said that at a certain point, we said that through HTML5, we got vector graphic natively. And the reason why we want to have a vector graphic is that these images have a very important property. That is, they do not lose quality when you try to change their size. Not even when you enlarge or you shrink them. These images are composed as a solution of mathematical equations. So we have a mathematical equation defining this shape here, this white part of the shape here, and inside this mathematical, the points that are inside the solution of the mathematical equation are going to be colored in this white color, for example. And these are quite useful, exceptionally for icons and other elements that are going to be scaled really a lot with respect to the responsiveness of the web page. However, there are some cases in which you are still basically forced to use raster images. For example, when you need to add pictures of people, because if you are not going to have, if you do not want to have a very complex and thus high weight vector image, raster image for some kind of effects and fading effect of colors still reach better result if they are not scaled, of course. When you need to scale things up, vector images are always better. But again, for vector images, you need someone that knows how to use a program to realize them. So you can choose if you are able to do it or not. So since we have few minutes left, let me just go for the very last couple of elements that I want to show you. The first is responsivity. So we said that we are going to use Bootstrap as a CSS framework for responsivity. However, also basic CSS enables you to have responsive websites. And to do this, you need to use media query. And media query is a way to describe if a CSS property is going to be applied or not, depending on the type of device I'm going to use. So for example, a screen or a printer, and the dimension that we are going to, that this media is going to show you to the, for the screen. So for example, this example, we have a screen. We are going to show this property of CSS only if we are on a display and the display is large, a minimum of 480 pixels. So this means that this is going to render, for example, is not going to be applied in old smartphones that were smaller than this. And you can even decide to use this media query to import the CSS. We are going to deal majorly on this aspect with Bootstrap because it's easier. But for example, remember that if you want to have a document that you think the user is going to print, maybe it's a good idea to have a media query for the printing, in which you make your page, for example, with a white background, with no image and black text, and so on and so forth, so that you let your user save up the ink of its printer. So here I add you some of the tips to do responsivity in basic CSS. However, remember that we are going to use Bootstrap for a reason. And the first thing you need to do is to set up the viewport. The viewport is something that says to your browser, get information on the device dimension of the screen and apply this to our website. And you are going to say that is a viewport and that what is the content you want to have, so, which is the kind of properties you want to link. In this case, the width of the screen that is equal to device width, to the device, the maximum width available on the screen device, and that the scaling that need to be applied is made with a ratio of 1. It means that for each pixel that should have been rendered in the normal web page, I render it in the same proportion. And remember to check that you are not disabling user scaling, otherwise this does not work anymore. And then, as we said, do not use the fixed width elements, so do not use the dimension on the pixel elements. Here I add you a list of standard media query that have been devised during the years. But again, this is just for if you want to go really down without using Bootstrap. Bootstrap is going to build up on all this stuff together for you. So you do not need to worry too much about it. Then you can have, in the last version of CSS, they have added this pseudo CSS property. And pseudo CSS is a way to define rules according to the special state of some of the elements that have been introduced. So, for example, you have pseudo classes, and pseudo classes are rules that are applied on the state of the tag, for example. So let's go with this example here, and you see that the color of this is an A tag, which means a link, and it means that if the link is active, you have a red color, is written in red. If it's already been visited, you are going to make it in green. If the mouse of the user is over the link, it is changed into a purple color. And if it's going to be pressed, if it's been pressing, you have a blue color of the link. You have the same element, and according to the state of the element, you are going to change some of the properties here. Similarly, you have pseudo elements that instead of affecting the whole tag or class, are going to affect one specific sub part of it. So, for example, in what I'm expressing here, you have the paragraph, and in this case, the first line of the paragraph is going to be written in red and in small caps. And you may have first line, you can have first letter, you can have whatever you want. Here, I show you some examples of how you can make things up. And I apply to all of you here the full documentation of the pseudo elements inside the official reference for CSS, which is the difference between A-link and E-active. So A-link it means that if I remember correctly, it means that the link is a valid link. So it's connected to somewhere. It does not mean that the page actually exists, but that it's a well-formatted URL you are pointing to. It's not going to check if on the other side the web page really exists. It's just checking that it's a valid URL. Whereas active, it means that it has been clicked, so the user has or is in the process of interacting with it. It's okay. Okay. So last element of this lecture, I've been already out of time, but the last element of the lecture is, as I promised you, animations. And this is quite a very interesting feature that have been added in CSS 3. It's quite complex actually to use, but it allows you to create animations that do not require code writing, which is very, very interesting as a feature. And it is basically composed of two functions. The first function is the keyframe part, in which you describe the graphical properties that are going to be changed and how there is the passage between one and the other. So you basically have these two options. In the first option, you are just saying that you start from a color and you need to reach the other one, and the effect is managed by the system automatically. Whereas in this other version, you are going to be able to use to define at any let's say at any frame, even if the frame are going to be expressed into percentage of the animation duration, what is the effect you want to achieve. So here you can have a much more granular control over the properties, whereas here it's less effective but easier to make. And then inside the properties, of the CSS code you want to animate, you are going to provide some information on the animation. So you are going to link the keyframe function. You are going to say how much the animation is going to last, how many times you need to wait before starting the animation, how many times you want to repeat the animation, and in which direction you should play the animation. So from 100 to 0 or from 0 to 100. In the first case is reverse, in the other one is direct version. All of these elements, except for animation time, has default values you can almost forget, but it's often good practice to say all of them. I link you here the official reference for all of these things, but you will see that there are very cool effects you can make. For example, one of my colleagues in the lab create a ship that was going for lip sync, and the lip sync based on the microphone was made only through a CSS animation, which is very, very interesting and very, very cool. How can I specify that the div element is associated to a certain set of keyframes? I mean, how can the keyframe function know which element is animated? The keyframe function do not know what is the element that is going to be animated. And here in the CSS, where you specify the animation name, you do not need to actually to use a tag. For example, the most common way to use it is to link it to an ID or a class of elements. and for all of the elements that match that class in the HTML file, you are going to apply simultaneously the same keyframe function. So basically, the keyframe function is shared between elements, and you can just select which kind of elements are going to be animated by using the proper selector here, so the tag, the class, or the ID. And maybe you can also have different elements. So you have an ID that said my first animated object, and the second is my second animated object. They share the same keyframe function, but maybe they have different parameters on the duration, the delay, the interaction count, and the direction. That's absolutely possible. The keyframe function is really just a blueprint that is going to be applied to whoever you want. Same question. So I cannot have multiple animation in the same page with different keyframes. No, you can. You just a keyframe is defined by this name. In this case, it is example. But if you want to create more keyframe function, you just create more add keyframe animation 1, animation 2, animation 3, whatever, and then you link. The problem is just that if the animation is going to clash because you add two animations to the same object, this is going to be a problem. Is there any other question, doubt, anything you want to clarify? Because we had already got out of time. So one of your colleagues is saying, maybe it's a redundant question, but I'm new to this. So there is a style sheet of CSS that is in the beginning of the HTML file. Then in the HTML body, how this style sheet is referenced. Okay, so you have a file called mytheme.css in the folder of your website. In the header part of your HTML page, you are going to say that there is a link. The rel is style sheet, the type is text/CSS, and the source is mytheme.css. Inside this theme.css, you have defined rules like this, where you have a selector, which is the name of a tag, the name of a class, or the name of an ID, curly brackets, properties, closed curly brackets. The browser at the beginning of your when you start rendering the web page is reading all your CSS elements, and then it's searching. I have this tag. I have reached the div tag. The div tag inside the CSS has any specific properties? Yes, it must be width 100 pixels, height 100 pixels, position relative, background color, yeah, whatever it is here. So I apply them. Then I check for the tag class. The HTML tag has a class attribute. Yes, the class attribute is my class. Inside the CSS file, is there my class definition? No, I skip it. Yes, I apply all those properties that are inside my myclass.css description, and in case I override the properties of the tag. Then I search for the ID. My div tag has an ID? No. Okay, I skip it. Otherwise, I go in the CSS, search for the ID, take the properties, and pass them together. So the reference between the CSS and the HTML is made on which is the information that is written here before the curly brackets in the rules. And then the connection is made by the browser when he reads the file. Is it clearer or is still foggy? Okay. So for animation, we should write them at the beginning of the CSS to mention them later inside the attributes. Okay, CSS is not ordered, so you can write things in any position you want. It's just a convention to add the keyframe function before the rules in which you use them, but actually it's not mandatory, so you can do whatever you want. Anyone else? Otherwise, I will stop the recording now, and we can decide that the lecture is off for now. So thank you all for attending, and have a nice day.